Mistborn Era 1 is beloved by many people and is one of the most highly recommended series you will find on BookTube. It has revived many people's love for the fantasy genre, but is Mistborn Era 2 the continuation the series deserved? Is it worth the read? Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Obviously, today I'm going to be talking about Mistborn Era 2 as a whole and whether or not it's worth reading. When I was first getting around to reading Mistborn Era 2, I was pretty worried about it. It really seems that, in general, this is a series that has a lot more discourse about it, especially compared to the first era of Mistborn. So I was really worried that I wasn't going to like it, that it was going to be a really big step down in quality, and I'm not sure it always gets painted in the best and most fair light when it comes to the series. Obviously, Mistborn Era 1 is such a beloved series for so many people. It's what brought them back to the genre. And so Mistborn Era 2 being so different from Era 1, I think rubs a lot of people the wrong way, and there are definitely some very valid reasons for that. And because I thought it was fun, let's go ahead and compare some of the stats between Mistborn Era 1 and Mistborn Era 2. So obviously Mistborn Era 1 has 3 books totaling almost 700,000 words, and Mistborn Era 2 has 4 books totaling almost 500,000 words. So Mistborn Era 1, even with one less book, is a little bit longer. Obviously, if you look, I used the Goodreads rankings and the number of reviews for each of the series. You can see that Era 1 definitely has many more reviews and in general has higher rankings than most of the Era 2 books. I will say, obviously, some of this makes sense. Era 1 has been out a lot longer than Mistborn Era 2, so it is a lot easier for it to have more rankings and reviews, but also I think some of the discourse around Era 2 has prevented as many people from moving on to the sequel. Obviously, I do also think that sequels in general a lot of times do have a slightly lower readership. And I'm going to go ahead and give you my rankings for the book so far, and this is for all of them. So my rankings go: in first place, we have The Final Empire, also known as Mistborn, The Hero of Ages. Those are both Era 1 books. And then we get the first appearance of an Era 2 book with The Bands of Mourning. That is the third Mistborn Era 2 book. Then you have the middle book in Era 1, The Well of Ascension, followed up by The Alloy of Law, The Shadows of Self, and finally, bringing up the pack, is The Lost Metal, the final book in Era 2. And that is actually the only book I gave a 3-star ranking for all of Mistborn. All of the other ones got a 4-star from me. So as you can see, even in my own rankings, while Era 2 is slightly below Era 1, an Era 2 book is right there in the mix. So now that I have given you my ranking, let me go ahead and tell you quickly what I found Era 2 to be about. Set in the same world as Mistborn Era 1, but one that has made some pretty good technological advancements in the 300 years since the ending of The Hero of Ages. We follow a new group of heroes, if you can call them that. Waxilium Ladrin and his sidekick Wayne are lawmen in the roughs outside of the main city until they are forced to move back. Once back, Wax finds it hard to drop his deputy lifestyle, and he starts to investigate a strange series of kidnappings and robberies. The story expands so much more than that, but that is the very small scale that this story starts at. So now let's go ahead and talk about what I think the positives of Mistborn Era 2 are. As with most Sanderson books, I find the world to be extremely fascinating, and that's no different here. Obviously, we are still on the same planet that Mistborn Era 1 took place in, but we have seen a lot of advancements in the 300 years since the last book. It is definitely much more of I almost want to call it steam-ish era. It's a little bit more than that. I don't know what the exact term people would use to describe this area is, but in general, it is kind of fun to see these advancements happening in society and how they're building these giant skyscrapers and all of these kinds of things. Maybe you could almost call it early industrial. It feels almost too advanced and not advanced enough to call it that, but it's somewhere in that kind of time range to give you a general idea of what the technology we're looking at. I will also say that the magic has definitely evolved in this series. So you don't just have your standard one type of allomancer, you have this interesting mix that's going on, at least with our main characters that we're following. And that is another thing I found really well. I think one thing that Sanderson did really well is not just having us follow another Mistborn. I think that would have just been kind of stale and had been way too similar to the first book. I think it was smart of him to move away from that, and I think it also made some of the things that happen more compelling because they didn't just have all these aces up their sleeves. In Era 1, when you're dealing with people who are Mistborns, you just know that they have so many things that they can do. They're like superhuman amongst superhumans, and the fact that that kind of gets dialed down a little bit, and Sanderson really creates some interesting magic in how it interacts with the world, is a huge pro for this series. And now for my character readers, I know that for a lot of people, characters are what really drive them through a series, and I really found a lot of the characters in this book to be great to follow through. Some of them took me more time to warm up than the others. I think some others really found their footing later in the series, especially compared to some of the first two books in particular. But I really found our main character Wax to be interesting, and he goes through a really interesting struggle throughout this series, and like the things he has to overcome, deal with, and just some of it I just found to be some of Sanderson's best character writing in the Mistborn. There is one character that I think most people will point to as a negative, but we will get to him when we get to the negatives. But one of my favorite aspects, and I think of the entire Era 2, is that there is this interesting mix of lore and basically religion that has made its way from Mistborn Era 1. All the things we see from there move into Era 2 and are kind of a part of this world. You have churches based off things. People have different beliefs on how they should behave because of people that, you know, were only alive 300 years ago. And that playing with religion, I think, is super, super interesting, especially because there are some parts of that world from 300 years ago that are still around. And seeing those things come together and mix and intertwine with today's society, where you do have people who are skeptical that the things that are written about happened at all. There are definitely people who don't think that those things happen. You have people who adamantly believe things happen a specific way, but then maybe they learn that that's not really what happened, or vice versa. And it's just a really cool mix of basically baking in doubt and an interesting conversation around religion in a world that is based on its own mythology and how it interacts. It almost reminds me a little bit of Norse mythology, where you have gods interacting in a weird way. I don't know why. I just feel like, to me, Norse gods interacted with their people a lot more. I don't even think that's necessarily true, but maybe God of War has warped my brain a little bit. And my last pro for the series is it is fun. Now, fun is a very difficult thing to just say about a book series because so many people will find things different about it. But for me, this is definitely a much more lighthearted read than, say, a lot of other epic fantasies. This just is a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more fun, not as serious, while there are serious things happening. And I think if you go into this series with that kind of mindset, that this isn't going to be the most in-depth thematic work, that this is going to be a little bit more fun and lighthearted, and I want to say silly, even though that's not the best description of it. I think that's a good thing, and I think it will set you up for success when you go to read this. And now we have to talk about the cons of this series. So I think the biggest controversial figure, and the thing that most people will bring up as a negative about this series, is that one character I mentioned earlier, and that would be Wayne. Wayne is supposed to be kind of the comic relief of this series, and as with a lot of things, humor is very subjective, and it seems like a lot of people do not click well with Sanderson's humor. Personally, for me, I found Wayne to be fine for the first two books. I kind of enjoyed him. I thought he was part of that silly aspect that kind of lightened the story. But as the last two books happened, he really kind of wore me down a little bit, and I could kind of see what people were talking about. And so your mind will definitely vary when it comes to your experience with Wayne. I will say I did have a lot of problems with him in the last book. I think the arc that he went on just wasn't fleshed out enough. And honestly, it kind of makes me a little bit angry, the kind of arc that happens with him. I wish I could say more, but obviously, book 4 spoiler, not going to do that. But just know that you might have very different feelings about Wayne, and you're not alone. I don't think he is enough of a negative to really destroy these books and make them unbearable. For me, I know for some people that is not the case, and they really do have a lot of issues with him. And I think he is a character that if I went back and reread these books, I would probably like him less from the beginning, and he would wear me down even more across my reread. Speaking of the last book in Mistborn Era 2, The Lost Metal, I had pretty significant problems with that book. Like I said, it is the only one I gave a 3-star ranking to, and I would say for a lot of people, it is pretty controversial. I think I'm more in the middle. It seems to be you either really liked it or really hated it, and there are a couple of reasons for that. For me, personally, it was that Wayne arc. I know a lot of other people think it is too Cosmere heavy, so there's a lot of greater Cosmere references and things going on in part of that book that I think just rubbed some people the wrong way. If you're not super into the Cosmere, I can see how that book in particular is a little difficult to enjoy by itself. If you've only, let's say you read Mistborn Era 1 and went straight into Era 2, you might have some mixed feelings about that much Cosmere heavy things happening. And I will also say that it doesn't feel like it needed to happen. It almost felt like that book was written because things needed to happen for things later in the Cosmere, which is kind of frustrating because you want the story to not be reliant on setting things up for later on in future series and or books that aren't even in the Mistborn. There's going to be 4 eras of it. So that is definitely one thing that rubbed me the wrong way. The story never got to that big epic scale that I wanted it to. And that's actually my last negative. This story does really feel self-contained in a small scope, where to me, Era 1, even though it only really takes place in one location, it just felt epic. It felt monumentous, and a lot of things that happen in Mistborn Era 2 feel more personal, more grudge-like. Like it definitely has that personal touch to it that I feel Mistborn Era 1 really only had a little bit of it in the Well of Ascension. And unfortunately, I just wanted a more sprawling tale to happen, and we get little bits and pieces of it because we are introduced to some things that are definitely a surprise, but I don't know, it just never really capitalizes on a lot of those things. I think that's probably what you can say for a lot of Mistborn Era 2. It doesn't capitalize on a lot of things that it set up. And I think part of that is the original premise behind Mistborn Era 2 was that it wasn't going to be an era. It was just going to be some like short side things that Sanderson wrote. And instead it ended up becoming its own era, which, you know, I'm happy I got them, but I do think there are definitely some missed opportunities inside of Era 2. So my overall conclusions and thoughts are, do I think personally that Mistborn Era 2 is worth the read, and do I recommend it to people who have read Mistborn Era 1? I say yes, I do. I think that it is absolutely worth reading. There are definitely flaws in it, but that great Sanderson storytelling is still inside of these books. And when you have that mixed in with the world and the magic, it is really hard to pass up the series. Now, I will not blame anybody for not reading it, because I can definitely see how it can rub people the wrong way. But let me know if you have read it, what you think of Mistborn Era 2, and if you haven't read it, do you plan on reading it now, or are you still going to stay away from it after watching this? But as always, have a good one.